Well, good evening, everybody, if you're watching this live in my Facebook group. And thank you if you're tuning in later on in my podcast or watching it on my YouTube channel. Tonight, I bring you another study. I'm trying to do more of these shorter nutrition in the news or studies that I find that I think will be of particular interest to you. And this one is with regards to gluten and a study that was conducted on mice. A small study conducted on mice, introducing gluten into the diets, and some findings that they weren't expecting. And in this case, what they actually found, amongst other things, is that gluten increased brain inflammation in these mice that were fed the gluten compared to those that weren't fed any gluten in the diet at all. Now, you may be thinking, well, surely a study on mice is not that relevant. I'm human, and this is mice, but as I'm sure you are well aware, mice, whether we like it or not, are frequently used in studies, particularly around drugs and things like that, but they're frequently used in studies. And that's because there are many similarities as a mammal between a mouse and a human. So it's very easy to compare between mice and humans. Of course, it's not going to be an absolute direct correlation, and therefore, yes, of course, it's important that further studies are conducted to look at this with humans. But apparently they have very similar digestive systems, nervous system, circulatory system, endocrine system as well. And that's why it was of particular interest with the researchers when they found this, and they weren't expecting it, to sort of prick up our ears really and say, gosh, gluten and inflammation in the brain, which of course we wouldn't want to see. It was a small study. It was less than 100 mice. They were male mice. Don't know if that's relevant. They were male mice, but a very small study, less than 100 mice. It was conducted over a 14-week period, and they split the mice into those on a low-fat diet, a high-fat diet, and either with gluten or without gluten. So, of course, there were four groups of mice where they were able to look at what was going on in the bodies. What they were particularly looking at is weight gain, other metabolic changes. When we think about metabolic changes, we're thinking about blood pressure, weight, obesity, that type of thing, blood sugar, irregularities. And they were also looking at general inflammation. They weren't surprised to see that those in the gluten group had a moderate increase in weight gain, probably slightly more for those in the high-fat diet than there was in the low-fat diet. But I'm focusing here on the outcomes to do with the gluten part of this. But it was surprising that they saw the hypothalamic region of the brain showing some inflammation. And the hypothalamic region of the brain is what coordinates metabolic functions like body weight regulation and blood sugar regulation, these metabolic functions that are so important. Now, why is this so relevant? Well, we know that we consume a huge amount of gluten in the Western diet. Where do we find it? We find it in wheat, in rye, and in barley. Now, of course, if you are celiac, you're going to be particularly sensitive to gluten, and therefore some people think, oh, don't oats contain gluten? No, oats don't naturally contain gluten. But if oats are produced in a factory that also produces wheat, it's why you will find on the market perhaps porridge oats or oat cakes, which are particularly marketed as gluten-free, because they can be absolutely sure there is no trace of gluten in those products. So wheat, we eat a lot of wheat in the Western world. Rye as well, rye bread, not so much rye, not so much barley, but very predominantly wheat-based diet. But just some thoughts as to why gluten may be causing this brain inflammation. Well, there are different components to gluten to do with proteins. Gluten is a protein, and it can be broken down into subsections. And some of this may be resisting. Well, we know some of it does resist digestion in the gut. and this can lead to an immune response. So when we think about the digestion of our food, and like gluten has to be digested by protein digesting enzymes, and certain components of gluten is resisting those enzymes that break down the proteins into their constituent parts, which are known as amino acids. And these then find their way further down in the gut, through the small intestines, and further on into the large intestines, the colon. Now, if they start building up, then it could potentially irritate the gut wall, the gut mucosal barrier. When it starts to irritate it, it can cause what we call intestinal permeability, commonly known as leaky gut. May seem like a bit of a strange thing to talk about, but when the gut lining, gut barrier is irritated, then what can happen is the gaps between the epithelial cells can be damaged. They can widen the gaps. And when the gaps are widened, it allows things to get through from the gut into the bloodstream that shouldn't. So whereas a amino acid is much smaller than a piece of protein, if the gut wall is damaged, then these partially digested or undigested proteins can get through those gaps and get into the bloodstream. And from there, our immune system detects it as foreign. Protein shouldn't find its way as a whole into the bloodstream. What should only be there are the amino acids, the fully broken down parts of proteins. So the immune system can detect it, go into overdrive, say that's foreign, it's not welcome. And this can set up reactions in the body. And it's one reason that's considered to be potentially what's causing the brain inflammation. We also know that when you've got foods that are finding their way through the gut, then it can start to alter the gut microbiome. I think I might have a wasp wandering around me because I've got my doors open. How embarrassing. Oh well. So that's what could be going on. Immune detection and creating inflammation, then going on to create that inflammation in the gut. So what do we do? And it is a wasp that I've got my eye on right now. What can we do? What are my final thoughts? Well, first and foremost, I do believe that we consume way too much wheat in the Western diet. We already know that some people are sensitive to gluten from a digestive point of view, probably because the gut is unable to break down all those proteins in the gluten, and then they start to irritate the gut. And we know, and I know with clients, it can cause bloating and discomfort. It can cause irregular bowel movements and other symptoms that are not that pleasant. So I think the first thing to think about is cutting right down on the amount of foods, particularly the wheats that we consume in our diet. We really need so many wheat-based products. You can look for gluten-free alternatives, and by that I don't mean by buying processed foods that say gluten-free. I think by buying a pasta that's made with lentils or with chickpeas, for example, or buying wraps that are made with sweet potato or oats, so they're going to be naturally gluten-free, or just thinking about moving away from so many starchy grain products and consuming more natural foods, protein foods and good fats and fruits and vegetables, and stopping this massive intake that we tend to have that's so grain focused, and that will automatically take the strain off our digestive system. And that might be all we need to do, rather than thinking you must avoid gluten altogether. So I hope you have found that interesting tonight. Do let me know in the comments if you're watching this live, or indeed if you're watching this on YouTube, please add some comments to give me some feedback. I hope you're going to enjoy the next few days in the UK. Invariably I end up talking about the weather because I'm British, but the sun is shining, it's glorious. I think we're expecting a nice few days. So let's make the most of it, and hopefully we can get outside, get some of that valuable vitamin D that I've been talking about, and just enjoy it, and hope we don't get pestered by too many wasps. Have a great week, everybody. Take care.